Good evening. Is the world becoming more secular? Why hasn't religion died out? How can we reconcile different religions? Or can we even do so? Welcome to the Veritas Forum at Harvard Divinity School. I'm Diane Kim, Harvard Divinity School graduate of class of 2015. And it's great to be back here in Memorial Church. I actually remember at graduation this past May, I was a little disappointed. I thought, I never got a chance to talk in front of a great big eagle, but I'm here today as proof that dreams actually do come true. So, we've been working very hard since last year to bring you this forum tonight. The forum is co-sponsored by the Black Graduate Ministries, Faculty Commons, Harvard Christian Impact, Harvard Divinity School, Harvard Divinity School Graduate Christian Fellowship, the Harvard Graduate School Christian Fellowship, the Institute on Culture, Religion, and World Affairs at Boston University, and Memorial Church. We would also like to give a special thanks to the Templeton Foundation for their support of this forum. Veritas Forums are hosted by Christian communities at over 100 universities across North America and Europe. Veritas is Latin for truth, so we're here tonight for a real discussion, connecting truth to our hardest questions and deepest beliefs. We have asked our presenters to share personally, ask honest questions of each other, and model a conversation that all of us can continue this evening and beyond. Our hope is that everyone in this room would be challenged. For those here who would identify as Christians, we hope you will be challenged by both our presenters to examine your faith with intellectual honesty and rigor. For those who may identify as Jewish, Muslim, Hindu, Buddhist, secular, humanist, agnostic, atheist, anybody I haven't named, or as many of us probably are, just figuring out what you believe, we hope tonight's event will be helpful to you on your spiritual journey. And we invite you to participate in the conversation through Q&A and bring your diverse perspectives to the discussion time afterwards. Now, the Veritas planning team aims to create events that are relevant, thought-provoking, and engaging to people of all backgrounds and beliefs. And we need your help with that. So, as you're entering, everybody got a 60-second quick survey and a super cute golf pencil. So right now we're going to take 15 seconds and fill out the top half of the survey card. And I will do that as well. Now, I promise, we'll only use your email address to send you a link to an online feedback site where you can share your thoughts on tonight's forum. We really want your feedback, so please do sign up for that. We promise not to sell your email address to a spam site or email you about anything else unless you check one of the boxes at the bottom of the card, or unless you win the raffle for the free iPad, and then I know you want that email. After the conversation, please fill out the remaining sections of your survey card, both on the front side and the back side. And at the end of the forum, please bring your card with you as you exit and leave it in one of the baskets provided. Now, normally this is a point where we tell you, please turn off your cell phones. But let's be honest here, nobody actually does that. So we're going to be a little different. We're going to encourage you to text during the forum. Specifically, we're going to encourage you to text your Q&A questions in on the number that is on the second page of your program. So text away, and then during the Q&A portion of the evening, we will choose the best and most popular questions, and some Harvard Divinity School students will be reading those questions and presenting them to our speakers. Now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Kristen Lucken. Kristen is a lecturer in International and Global Studies, Religious Studies, and Sociology at Brandeis University. Her research focuses on ethnic and religious identity in an age of globalization. She is the ideal moderator for our discussion tonight, so let's welcome her.
Thank you. The theme for tonight is, why hasn't religion died out? In the secular university today, it is often taken for granted that religion is irrelevant to the intellectual project, and that as time goes by and more of the world becomes educated and modern, fewer people will take religious beliefs seriously. Religion is a cultural artifact which informs the clothes we wear and the kind of food we eat, but it has little to do with questions of fundamental truth. New atheist public intellectuals like Richard Dawkins see belief in God as delusion, and the Enlightenment Project as the beginning of a great awakening as the human race goes beyond its deluded religious roots. From this perspective, religious believers are on the wrong side of history. But how does this meta-narrative square with empirical evidence? Is the world becoming more secular as it becomes more modern? Or has secularization, ironically, turned out to be the delusion? I'm privileged to introduce two world-class public intellectuals to lead our conversation tonight. Peter Berger is Professor Emeritus of Religion, Sociology, and Theology at Boston University and is widely regarded as one of the greatest living sociologists of religion. With over 75 published books, Peter Berger has revolutionized the field of sociology. His most recent publication, The Many Altars of Modernity Toward a Paradigm for Religion in a Pluralist Age, draws on decades of research and reflects on the relationship between modernity and religion. It explores the implications of the growing realization that secularization theory, or the widely held belief that global modernization would lead to a decline in religion, is in fact empirically untenable. In its place, Peter Berger offers a new paradigm through which to understand religion in the modern age. Ross Douthat is a New York Times columnist and author of Bad Religion: How We Became a Nation of Heretics, which the Washington Post calls a superb documentation of America's crisis of faith. Among his other publications are Grand New Party and Privilege, Harvard, and the Education of the Ruling Class. He is the youngest regular op-ed writer in the history of the New York Times, having been invited at the young age of 29 to fill the position. Ross has been described as its most consistently thoughtful and level-headed opinion columnist. So please join me in welcoming Peter Berger and Ross Douthat. We will begin the evening with opening remarks from Peter Berger.
Good evening. What I propose to do this evening is to introduce to you what, Kristen used the term paradigm, which sounds like a megalomaniac term. It simply means a way of looking at things. And over the last few years, no single individual can do that. Over the last few years, I, together with some colleagues, both in this country and in Europe, have been working on a new way of looking at the relationship of religion and modernity. Maybe totally false, but I think it's interesting, and I happen to think it's empirically valid. Well, I don't have very much time to do this. This is a very Japanese-oriented evening. Every 5 minutes seem to be programmed. And I told Ms. Kim, that I would ignore the time limits if I have to, but I'll try to keep roughly, with being a polite person, roughly within the time limit I was given. But let me put it this way. Einstein succeeded in putting his theory in one mathematical formula. I can't do that. Luther needed 95 theses to start the Reformation. By the way, the 500th anniversary of the nailing of the 95,000 theses on the castle door of Wittenberg comes next year. By the way, there was no castle door, but let's not go into this. It's a nice image, nailing these. It happened to be the university bulletin board, and he was really putting down what he wanted to do in the following semester. He didn't know what the effect would be. Well, I'm not going to put 95 theses before you that keep you here way beyond your bedtime. What I will do is I will try to sum up what I have to say on this topic in 6 theses. 4 of them are social scientific theses, and basically are the result of our work on what we still call a new paradigm, although I assure you this is not meant in some megalomaniac sense. Since this is a Christian organization that is sponsoring this, I don't know if Memorial Church, or for that matter the Harvard Divinity School, still considers itself Christian. But since these are the auspices, my last 2 theses have to do with what I think, from a Christian point of view, one can say about the empirical picture that the first 4 theses paint. Okay, I think that's enough by way of introduction. Thesis number 1, and that is where I'm afraid I run right up against what some of you probably think. The thesis is very simple, but has far-reaching implications. Contrary to what many people think, we don't live in a secular age. We live in a pluralist age, which is a very different story. The distinguished Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor wrote a book with the title The Secular Age a few years ago. It's the biggest book I've ever tried to read. It's over 800 pages. And some of it is quite interesting. He's a very competent philosopher, but already the title of the book is wrong. We don't live in a secular age. Most of the world is more religious than it ever was. The exceptions, really, not the United States. The United States is still a very religious country. It may not seem that way from the perspective of Harvard Yard, but most of the country is very religious still, despite what some misleading survey data have told you recently. You have to look at who these nuns are, no religious affiliation, what they really are. They're not militant atheists at all. No, the exception to the statement that the world is very religious, there's a geographical exception, which is basically Europe, with some outliers like Australia, New Zealand, perhaps. And there is an international intelligentsia, which is secular. But most of the world isn't secular at all. There's this pluralist, and that makes an enormous difference. I now use the term 2 pluralisms. I will explain the second term in a moment. But the first meaning of pluralism is what in everyday language one calls pluralism. Many different religions operating more or less at peace within the same society. If they exist in the same society and kill each other or never talk to each other, that's not pluralism. But in much of the world today, this coexistence is relatively peaceful, and people talk to each other. That's the basic pluralism, the plurality of religions. Then there is something where the old secularization theory, the people who believed the more modern, the more secular the world will be, were not completely wrong. There is a secular space, and that's the other pluralism, is the interaction between religious discourses and the secular discourse, without which a modern society could not exist. Now, the religious pluralism is obvious. Hare Krishnas are chanting and dancing in front of medieval cathedrals in Europe. I was once disturbed a few years ago. I was having lunch with the Archbishop of Vienna, and we didn't know this noise came overlooking the cathedral. It was Hare Krishnas dancing. South Korean businessmen who are also Protestant missionaries smuggled Bibles into China and Central Asia. There are now about 16 million Muslims within the European Union. They are growing by several thousand as we talk. The estimate now is there are about 100 million Christians in China, which is slightly more than members of the Communist Party, and so on and so forth. And the United States, for historical reasons which are not difficult to explain, has been in the vanguard of religious pluralism. And that has been sanctified, as it were, by the American Constitution. And the combination of pluralism, which is a fact, and religious freedom, which is a legal value, is dynamic, and the United States expresses that dynamism very vividly, and I would say on the whole rather successfully. Now, I'm still speaking as a sociologist. I'm not saying whether this is good or bad. I'm speaking, as it were, from behind the antiseptic mask of social scientific objectivity. But there are enormous consequences of pluralism. I'm talking about the first pluralism, in terms of individual faith, in terms of religious institutions, and in terms of the state, finally. In terms of individual faith, what pluralism does is it undermines the taken for grantedness of any religious tradition. Because there are all these other people with whom you constantly rub shoulders who don't believe and don't practice what you believe. For very basic psychological reasons that will influence you. And one thing it does, you can no longer take for granted where you happen to be born in terms of religion. Secondly, it changes the nature of religious institutions. Whether they like it or not, and some of them don't like it at all, they become voluntary associations. It changes the relationship between clergy and lay people. The laity gains power, they become consumers. The clergy can't use the police to fill the pews, they have to persuade people to come in and to stay in. And it changes the nature of the state, because all this plurality has to be managed politically if it isn't to explode. So the enormous consequences to pluralism, not secularity, not secularism, but pluralism, which is creating these big changes. Now, in terms of taken for grantedness, I read somewhere that in ancient Greece, when two strangers met somewhere, they asked each other, "What are your gods?" The contemporary equivalent would be to ask your zip code or your area code. If you could answer who your gods were, you would know where the person came from. That is no longer the case. Okay, I don't have to expand on this. But it's not only individuals that change, it's religious institutions that change, that become voluntary and that are in competition with other institutions of the same kind. Richard Niebuhr, the American church historian, said the peculiar American contribution to sociology of religion, concepts of religion, is the denomination, which he defined as a church which recognizes de facto, de jure, the right of other churches to exist. And ecumenism is the polite expression of this new relationship. Well, I will not go on taken for grantedness, although I could talk way beyond my allotted time to just talk about that first thesis. What does it mean that religion is no longer taken for granted? Any religion, any religious tradition. Fundamentalism, by the way, can be explained as a project to revoke that loss of taken for grantedness, to restore either an old or a new unanimity on worldviews. It's very difficult to do. And you have to set up a totalitarian society that controls all communications. And the good news of the 20th century, not many good news from the 20th century, is that's very difficult to do, unless you want to completely isolate yourself from the world economy and world communications. Voluntary association. I said whether you like it or not. The most interesting and, I think, instructive example of a religious institution, in this case a church, Christian church, that has very successfully related to the loss of taken for granted. This is the Roman Catholic Church. There are almost exactly 100 years between the First and Second Vatican Council. The First Vatican Council was called by Pius IX, author of the Syllabus of Errors. He had some 80 errors that the Pope must never accept. And then the basic idea was the Roman Catholic Church has the truth. The truth has the right to proclaim itself publicly, but error in principle has no rights. It may be permitted out of necessity or out of good-heartedness, but error has no rights. The truth has rights, and we have the truth. Vatican II, as you know, I would say its most, at least for non-Catholics, most remarkable contribution is the Declaration on Religious Freedom, which defined religious freedom as a fundamental human right, not for Catholics, but for all religious people and for those who have no religion. It's an enormous change, and the Roman Catholic Church has never been the same since then. And that process of accommodation to pluralism and to religious freedom is still going on very powerfully. Okay, first thesis, not secularism, not secularity, but pluralism. Secondly, pluralism undermines taken for grantedness of any religious tradition. Third thesis, churches become voluntary associations. All religious groups become voluntary associations, especially in America. Take Judaism. Judaism, after all, has been the religion of a people. Say in Eastern Europe, when you had these little Jewish communities in Russia and elsewhere, to be a Jew was a destiny. It's not a destiny anymore, certainly not in America. It's a choice. And how you count it, there are at least 4 and maybe more Jewish denominations. If you count the different Hasidic sects, there are even more. And there's an American Jewish joke which expresses this perfectly. An American Jew is stranded on a desert island, all by himself, and he builds 2 synagogues, one in which he prays and the other in which he never wants to be seen or caught dead in. That's denominationalism. And that's increasing all over the world. Not because of American influence, but because similar conditions appear all over the world. That was number 3. Number 4, let me say a couple things about the secular space. When I started out as a sociologist of religion, which as some of you know was the year of Lincoln's second inaugural, I believed in secularization theory because everyone else did. It wasn't crazy. There were some good reasons for it. Its basic proposition was very simple. The more modern, the less religious. Okay? It took me about 25 years to conclude that this was a mistake. It was empirically untenable because of what I said in my first thesis. The world is not becoming ever more secular. The world is becoming, or not becoming, remains strongly religious. But where secularization theory wasn't completely wrong, and where, by the way, Taylor's book is still quite interesting to read, even if you don't accept the implication of the title. Every modern society needs a secular space. The basic reason for this is science and technology. You cannot have a modern society without at least a minimum of technology. My favorite method of thinking is free association. And I mentioned Judaism, let me mention a Jewish example that comes to mind and landed in my notes. I know a very successful Jewish surgeon in Boston. He's a practicing Orthodox Jew, I guess modern Jewish in terms of Jewish denominationalism. In fact, he wears a yarmulke in his office. And he's a very, very nice man. His patients love him. He's very warm. He's a mensch, as they say in Yiddish. And I think it has something to do with his religion. He regards his vocation, I don't know him very well, but his vocation as a mandate for every pious Jew to help in the repair of the universe, which has many flaws, and human beings can help correct those flaws. But when he enters the operating room, you couldn't tell whether he wears a yarmulke because he has this cap on, and everything he does must be by strictly secular discourse. And his being a practicing Jew is irrelevant. If he has a problem in the course of the surgery, he cannot consult the Talmud. He has to operate exactly as if he were a Buddhist or a Presbyterian or an atheist or whatever. Secular discourse. It's not only, well, the hospital is a temple of modernity, but let's not go into this. We recently had a fascinating conference on that at BU. But it's constantly infiltrated by religion. Hospital chaplains visiting clergy and relatives, patients who pray, nurses who have prayer circles, medical faculties who are interested in alternative healing methods, which usually are either from India or from China. It's not isolated from religion. It interacts with religion. And I think this is very important to understand. I recently came on the writings of a famous Dutch jurist of the 17th century, Hugo Grotius, one of the founders of modern international law. And he wrote that his new discipline was to be handled as if God did not exist. Now that was not a statement of philosophical atheism, it was a methodological statement. Grotius himself was a pious Protestant. He was an Arminian, which I would call the more humane version of the Dutch Reformation. And he was kicked out of the newly independent Netherlands by the Calvinists who were then in charge. But international law was not going to be based on his religion. It couldn't be. By the time he wrote, European states, some defined themselves as Catholic, some as Protestant, Anglican, Lutheran, Calvinist. Then you had Orthodox Russia, and you had the Ottoman Empire. International law that would be applicable to all of them would have to be religiously neutral. Couldn't be any particular religion. But it expanded into other areas of life, certainly expanded into domestic law. An American judge who operates under state law or under federal law has whatever his religion or lack of religion may be, he cannot apply it to the case which he's supposed to judge. He has to bracket his religion. He operates in secular space. That secular space also has to be managed. And what has to be managed is the dividing lines between religious spaces and the secular space. And in the United States today, there are constant litigation. Well, America is the most litigational society on earth. People constantly sue each other. It's a national pastime. I'm still looking for somebody plausible to sue. I haven't found one. Deep pockets, preferably. So the secular space is very important, and in itself, it can become a foundation of religious freedom, because religious freedom is a prerogative. It's a very efficient way of handling both pluralisms. Let me then say again something that goes against what many people think. Religion and secularity, for most people who are religious, is not a question of either or. It's a question of both and. And you don't have to travel very far from where we are now to experience this every day. For the last few years, I periodically taught at the Baptist University in Texas. And there you meet people who are intensely religious, but are as modern as you can get. Petroleum engineers, brain surgeons, you name it. It's not either or, it's both and. Sometimes there are tensions, sometimes there are not. According to my allotted time, I have about 5 minutes left. I think I probably can do it in 5 minutes. And now I will take off my surgical mask and put on my theological hat. I usually describe myself as incurably Lutheran, but it's not the Lutheranism of the Missouri Synod. It's a very open-minded and undogmatic Lutheranism, which is not my job to explain to you tonight. And one thing I want to emphasize, my change of mind about secularization theory had nothing to do with my own personal faith. It had to do with how I read empirical evidence. And I was not the only one. Most sociologists of religion have come to the same conclusion. There are some who hold out, and I admire them. I admire people who don't follow the herd, wherever the herd is going. but they're a very small minority now. Okay, two more theses I promised you, and they are not sociological, they are theological theses. And they're Christian theological theses, although other religions may very well put their own spin on them. Well, let me put in a commercial here. My own take on what this whole means, I put in a book called The Many Altars of Modernity, published in the US and in Germany simultaneously, in English, last year. The Many Altars of Modernity. I have, over the years, lots of experience, acquired a deep respect for African culture, its wisdom and its wit. So I will quote here my favorite Zulu proverb, which says, if I don't beat my own drum, who will? So I mentioned my book, which is readily available. Okay, two more theses, which are not sociological, but theological. Both say the same thing. Pluralism is good for you if you're a person of faith. Don't be afraid of it. Why is it good for you? Well, one thing is because it puts us right into the position of the early Christians. The world into which Paul carried the gospel, an obscure Jewish sect in Palestine, was highly pluralistic, especially in its cities. Just think of Apostle Paul's famous sermon in Athens, where he talked about the many altars in Athens. Why should we deplore the situation which saw the beginnings of the Christian religion? I think the situation allows us a new understanding of faith. Faith is not knowledge. Preachers often present the antithesis faith and lack of faith, and lack of faith is some kind of sin. I think it's very misleading. The opposite of faith is not lack of faith, it's knowledge. I think I know that I'm right now in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and not in Vienna, where I come from, or Washington, where I was last week. I know this, although a philosophy student may try to explain to me that how do I really know this? Maybe I'm just imagining this, I'm dreaming. You don't exist, you're a dream. I do know it. I'm sure I know it.
towards the Near East and are connected to Russia's traditional vision of itself as a protector of fellow Christians against the Ottoman Turk originally. Putin's posture and rhetoric around ISIS is an extension of that kind of rhetoric, and so on. And in all of these cases, you can try and sort of abstract the religious element away, and you can say, well, Putin's just motivated by power in this sense, and the young men of ISIS just want to rape and pillage and do terrible things, and the migrants going to Europe are in search of a better life, and the people who are not necessarily being welcoming to the migrants aren't themselves, the most devout of Christians, and so on. And, all of that's true, but it's still also true that there is a bright religious thread running through all of these stories, and these stories would be very different absent the religious element. The fact of ISIS's presence in the Middle East is connected to chaos, violence, civil war, and so on. But the nature of ISIS is defined by a particular interpretation of Islam, right? I mean, you could imagine a different version of ISIS that was barbaric and had some other organizing theory or no theory at all, but the reality is, to understand what the specific things ISIS is doing, it helps to understand why they think they are restoring a imaginary, but in their minds, purified form of Islam, and so on. So that's, that would just be the sort of foreign affairs headline version of the case for the point I was making. But then, beyond that, I think it's simply the case that if you step anywhere outside the richest, most developed parts of the world, you will find intense religious growth. Latin America, it's Pentecostal and evangelical. Africa, it's Islamic and Christian. China, it's Christian. South Asia, it's all kinds of things. So there's that, and then even in the West itself, even in the most secularized portions, even in Northern Europe, these sort of ghostly elements of religion are still there, and people are not fully, even the most secular people are very rarely fully secularized.
Thank you. You mentioned China, and a sociologist who's Chinese American named Fenggang Yang has argued that universities need to undergo a paradigm shift, much like a scientific revolution, in light of the strong empirical evidence that the world is not becoming more secular. Do you agree? And if so, what should that paradigm shift look like?
I mean, paradigm shift, as we've been told, is a very strong, megalomaniacal sounding term. So maybe I won't use the term paradigm shift. But I would say that the modern university could do a better job of, approaching and understanding religion than the modern university is deeply shaped by assumptions that are fundamentally connected to the secularization thesis, right? And this goes back to 19th century revolutions in the nature of the university, how people conceived of the mission of the university. It's connected to sort of John Deweyan theories of education and democracy and so on, all of which I think are just connected to a pinched and narrow view of what the modern future and the human future is likely to bring. And that doesn't mean that once Protestant, now secular universities like this one need to become Protestant again. Maybe some of them should, but it does mean that essentially, at the very least, the great universities of the West could stand to spend a little more time thinking about how their official commitment to diversity of thought, to intellectual pluralism, and so on, could make room for more voices that not only are interested in and understand religion, but try to understand it from the inside, which is to say, are religious themselves. And so I don't know if it's a paradigm shift, but I think, Harvard University would be a better version, even on its own terms, of its own self, if it had more Catholics, Protestants, Orthodox Jews, Muslims, and so on the faculty who were practicing believers. And there are supply and demand issues here, obviously, with academic talent, and there's an endless and circular debate about whether the fact that the university is secular discourages religious academics from pursuing academic careers, or whether the university is secular because religious people don't go into academia and so on. And those are all, again, issues that would take much too long to unpack, and probably Peter has more interesting thoughts than I do. But at the very least, I think that the commitment that schools like Harvard make to the pursuit of racial, ethnic, and socioeconomic diversity could stand to be augmented by a focus on an intellectual diversity that makes more room for both serious study of religion, but also serious study of religion that takes the possibility that religious views are true seriously.
Peter has made the case that unlike in traditional societies where religious worldviews are taken for granted, modernization causes people, as he said, to rub shoulders daily with people whose religious views differ radically. This can cause people to respond more conservatively as they look for certainty in fundamentalism. Alternatively, people may relativize their beliefs. So Christianity may be true for you, while Hinduism is true for me. Ross, in America today, is this sense that all religions are equally valid a commonly held belief, especially among those in their teens and 20s?
Oh, well, yeah. I mean, yes, absolutely. And I think the way Peter framed it, just the idea that, that the more you have contact with diversity, the harder it becomes to believe that your particular your particular church has a monopoly on the truth. That's a deep and important insight. And it's connected, to sort of the immediate pluralism of people having friends and neighbors of different religious persuasions, but it's also just connected to communications technology, television, the internet, globalization, and so on. The fact that we have semi-immediate access to, life in Southeast Asia, life in Africa, life in Russia, and so on, that all these aspects of sort of the global human family are available to us virtually at any time, I think just makes it very hard to sit down and think, okay, but my First Presbyterian church that my parents took me to, on the town green, is the one true church, right? That just becomes a lot harder. And you see this in endless versions of public opinion data, but they had the famous Middletown study, which was Muncie, Indiana, I think, where they went and sort of looked at what was supposedly a representative American community. And I think there was a version in the 30s or 40s and a version in the 70s or 80s, and the question was, do you think Christianity is the one true religion and everyone should be converted to it? And there weren't big differences in terms of religious practice between those two eras, but there were huge differences between the first question and between the first era and the second. Over that 40-year period, this sort of middle American community just became less likely to say, yes, Christianity is the one true faith and everyone should be converted to it. And that has big implications, right? And it's why there's the sort of the big trend, at least as I see it, in American religion over the last 50 or 60 years, has not been towards unbelief, sort of deep skepticism, not towards Richard Dawkins style, slam the book down, that's it for God, but it has been towards a sort of relativistic view of faith that is also then, of necessity, a kind of partially deinstitutionalized form of faith, because no matter what, if you don't have that assumption that your institution is the institution, your bond to it is going to be weaker. And then beyond that, it ends up seeming to many people, we are a consumer society after all, that it's not just that you should, church shop, it's that you can create your own religion, right? You can take a little bit of Buddhism, a pinch of Hinduism, some of your Christian background, and some Zen aphorisms and so on, and you can do yoga and recite the Serenity Prayer and so on, and you will have your own religion that works for you. This is why I tend to think Eat, Pray, Love, Elizabeth Gilbert's best-selling book, is sort of an incredibly representative religious text for our age. It's a very sincere portrait of an intense religious quest that does not end with conversion. It doesn't end with her saying, well, I found God in India, therefore I should become a Hindu. Or I found God in India, but this has confirmed me in my childhood Christian faith. It just ends in a sort of open-ended way where she's had encounters with the divine and that shapes her life, but she's not submitting to any pre-existing tradition. And so I think that's one of the big, when we talk about, we can talk about it as secularization, we can talk about it as pluralism, but that sort of individualism, deinstitutionalization, and so on is a big and inevitable part of this story, at least for now.
Look, what you describe is a lot of data, and it's a wonderful data, but American data, great.
We're good at data.
Yeah, American sociologists can be pretty good with data. But look, pluralism doesn't mean, relativization doesn't mean relativism. Relativization means I'm not as sure as my grandparents were. But it doesn't mean everything is the same. All religions can't be true. They contradict on many points. And if you're a person of faith, of whatever faith, you are putting your bet on a particular form of faith. You say, I'm a Christian, I'm a Muslim, I'm a Buddhist, which means all the other ones are less true. So relativism is when you say all religions are the same. They are not all the same. And if you have faith, you have a particular faith. At least most people do. Some will well described, as you just did. A little bit from India, a little bit from my Catholic grandmother, etc. But most of it I put like a Lego game, I put together. That's a very significant group of people. But come with me to Central Texas, where I spent a lot of time recently, and many people are not like that at all. They are evangelical Christians. They may be more tolerant than their grandparents were. They are. But most of them are. But they affirm something. I think that's important. And in terms of America, I think it's very interesting. I mentioned Central Texas, but it's not just Central Texas. It's the Sun Belt overlaps with the Bible Belt. That's very interesting. And the Sun Belt is one of the economically most dynamic, if you like, most modern parts of the country. Enormously vital economically, rationally, and yet the fortress of evangelical Protestantism still today. That's very significant. And that's why I said for most religious people of whatever tradition, religion and secularity are not a question of either or, a question of both and. And what both and means has to be negotiated by individuals and by religious communities.
Peter, you've described modernization as a movement from fate to choice, where people are no longer just continuing beliefs of the community into which they were born without ever having to question. Instead, they're becoming more conscious of the need to choose.
Conscious of what?
The need to choose what to believe. What does this mean for a person living in America today, particularly those in their early 20s?
Well, I don't know that early 20s are a particularly privileged population. I mean, everyone in America, unless you live in a kind of sectarian subworld, is confronted with pluralism every day and has to come to terms with it. I mean, you get in interview situations, wonderful interviews about everyday religion. Someone says, well, I happen to be Catholic, a wonderful phrase, I happen to be. Interesting. I hurt my foot, I happen to be Catholic. My grandmother still goes to Mass every morning. I don't. I'm not sure what I believe. My wife is Protestant. My daughter is dating a Jewish boy. And my son is into Buddhism. This is not unusual. And people have to come to terms with this in their own lives. That doesn't mean that the guy who says, I guess it was the man who said it in my example, could be the woman, said, I happen to be Catholic, that there's no faith there anymore. But it's not as, there is some doubt surrounding it. And I think that's a good thing. And if you value freedom, which I think we should, it's important that religion is a free choice, a free act, ongoing free act. And there's not a condition like your hair color or your particular allergy. It's not like that. It's something you have to affirm, you have to have faith in.
Well, I think that's a very, if I may, Protestant perspective. And I think one difficulty is that apply, throw it back in my face and say, see, it is a threat. But I do think that there are sort of tensions there between what pluralism asks of us and what a lot of Christians going back to the earliest centuries of the faith have thought that the New Testament asks of them, which is to go and make disciples of all nations, and which would mean making disciples of as many people as possible within this nation, which would have inevitably transformative effects that would transform pluralism as well.
I don't think if we had more time, we'd disagree very much.
Probably not.
I mean, I can agree with much of what you say, maybe not some of the details, but I think a strong affirmation of faith in no way means a contradiction to pluralism. On the contrary, it flourishes under pluralism.
I hate to end here. I think we could go on for another hour or two, but I'm going to hand the floor back to our MC, Diane Kim. And before we do that, let's thank our presenters, please.
Thank you. I hope all of you had an enjoyable and thought-provoking evening. Now, before everyone rushes off to the reception with free food, yes, I said free food, and I know y'all are students, so I'm going to hold you for 3 more minutes, and I promise it's 3 because I timed myself beforehand, okay? So just sit tight. And since you're going to be here for 3 more minutes anyway, let's all go ahead and fill out those survey cards that you still have. Get out your pencils. All right. Yes, God wants you to do it. And while you do that, let me tell you about our 2 upcoming forums here at Harvard. If you enjoyed tonight, you should come to Sanders Theater on October 27th, where we're going to have Harvard's very own professor, Steven Pinker, in dialogue with UPenn's law professor, David Skeel, on The End of Violence, a Christian and a secular humanist discuss human nature and the possibility of peace. The tickets are available today, starting today at the Harvard box office. And then on November 6th, we're going to go across the river to Harvard Medical School with Jimmy Lynn, Bickel Doss, and Doug Laufenberger talking about Can Science and Faith Coexist? A discussion from a Christian and Hindu perspectives. Tickets are available online through our website, veritas.org. Furthermore, if you want something that's a more regular series, please consider attending the Religions and Practice of Peace Colloquium at Harvard Divinity School, a monthly series directed by Dean Hempton to explore how individuals and communities can draw on religion to foster mutual understanding, justice, and peace. More information can be found at hds.harvard.edu. Finally, as some of you might know, we've been hosting small discussion groups all across Boston this week. If you signed up for one of these, and actually everyone else here tonight, whether you're a student or not, is welcome to come next door, 2 buildings over, to the Queen's Head Pub, to the reception where there is, yes, free food. And there we can continue the conversation. If you were never assigned to a group, that's fine. Just feel free to join any of the groups that are there, and then you can talk about your own thoughts on why hasn't religion died out. Okay, I lied. That was actually 2 minutes and 30 seconds, so I'm letting you out early. Let's give all our presenters and moderators another round of applause. Thank you again. Enjoy your evening.